Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce Robert K. Nelson. He is director of the Digital Scholarship Lab at the University of Richmond. He has a PhD in American Studies from the College of William and Mary, and he is spearheading the wonderful website American Panorama. I'm also thrilled because Rob is a consultant on our digital urban renewal project, and we had a wonderful conversation yesterday for about 2.5 hours. So I'm really thrilled to introduce Rob and to hear what he has to say. Rob?
Well, really a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Deborah and David in particular for bringing me in. I'm looking forward to this. I'm now nervous because I saw the evaluations, which I get rated as excellent, satisfactory, or poor, so let's see if this goes well. This might not be the best way to start this off, so let's just, if you are looking forward to this talk, I'm going to touch a little bit upon it, but that title's gone, and this talk has changed a little bit. And so my new title is Digital Humanities as Craft, and I'm going to kind of walk through a tour of the project that David mentioned, which is American Panorama, which is our effort to, ongoing effort, which we've been at for years and years, to create a wide-ranging digital atlas, historical atlas of U.S. history. I've come to think of what I do as, it's definitely not science, and I don't think of it as an art, but the work that we do, my colleagues and I and collaborators on this project do, I think of this as a craft. And so what I want to talk about today is, it's going to be a tour of a number of the maps that we've made in American Panorama, and so it's going to kind of meander a little bit, but there's 3 threads that I want to highlight that I want to talk about. 2 of them relate, maybe all of them relate to issues of design. So one thread I want to talk about and kind of walk through our thinking process about is how we use design to push users gently in interpretive directions, right? So not just visualizing data, but visualizing data in particular ways that suggests directions and ideas and interpretations and analyses. Second thread kind of works in the opposite direction, which is to take the data and visualize it in a multitude of ways to enable discovery and exploration, to kind of see it from different angles so that there's a kind of productivity around the exploratory play that can become interpretive ends that we might still be gesturing towards, but the interpretive possibilities exceeds our interpretive intent, I guess I'd say. And the third is, because these are mapping projects, is the attention that we've paid to issues of scale and trying to realize that people are coming at us with different interests. They might be interested in the local, they might be interested in the national, and there's another issue, which is the national views of maps are great at looking at systems, they're great at looking at structures, but they often miss the local and sometimes the individual. So we have paid particular attention and try to balance these things where we look at the systematic and the structural, but then are mindful and try to counterbalance that with attention to individual experience. So, I just start with this Hulk map, which I am going to start by talking about redlining maps, and particularly the redlining map of Albany. But the one thing I would draw your attention to, because I will come back to it, is the concentric circles that radiate out from the center of the city at 1 mile, this is useful because there's a point I want to make about that later. So all this is available on the web if you are interested in looking out and exploring it. This is probably the biggest, most impactful project that we've done in American Panorama, which is a project that's about the 200 redlining maps that were produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the federal government, between 1935 and 1940. I used to have to explain a lot more about redlining than I do now when we started this project. Now you can't watch a Democratic debate without redlining coming up. But to give you a little bit of sense of the map, redlining is the process of cutting certain geographic areas, certain people off from mortgage financing, access to capital, and in the 1930s, the federal government made these maps which rated the mortgage security of neighborhoods in cities large and small across the country. And most of them use the same color scheme where it goes, it's a A to D scale, with A being best, D being hazardous, and the colors go green, blue, yellow, red. Think of this like a traffic light, right? Green is a signal to banks, go. These are safe investments. Yellow is exercise caution, and D is stop. These are hazardous, and conservative, because responsible lenders will hesitate to make loans in those areas. Now, the immediate question is like, so who does this impact? Like, how does this have an impact upon the people who are actually getting loans? And if you know anything about redlining, it's not going to surprise you. We'll pick a neighborhood. This is Albany South End, down by the river. And let's actually look at, this is the area description. They filled out different kind of survey instruments to justify the grades that they were given. And one of the things that was really important was who lives there. So if you look at item 2, inhabitants, and you can see who they're interested in. They're interested in the presence of African Americans, 2D, Negro. They're interested in the presence of immigrants, foreign-born families. And they worried about, you look at E, the language they use is infiltration, worried about the infiltration of undesirable, heterogeneous populations compromising the stability and the values of homes in certain areas. And you could see that in the South End, it was an immigrant community with 75% of the population, that estimate being Italian and of Italian descent. And the clarifying remark for this neighborhood, oh, actually, there's one other thing. Greenlead is known as the red light district. So apparently that's where Albany's red light district was. Is it? Is that a red light district on Green Street today? No. Okay. And in the clarifying remarks, they categorized classes as a slum neighborhood. Just looking at some of the other D neighborhoods, you're going to see a similar pattern. So I believe this is still the South End, and it's just a little bit further to the west, and it's 60% Italian. On the north side of downtown, or the state capital, Arbor Hill is, as you can see from the clarifying remarks at the top, most of the city's Negro population resides in the northeastern portion of this section. And they have a few foreign-born, so that was the more African-American neighborhood of Albany. And then a little bit to the west of that, you have a community. This is West Albany, or is that still that name today? I'm not sure. With 50% Poles and German descent, so more recent, but also second-generation immigrants. This is, again, like the local scale, really kind of attending to neighborhoods. People really care about the places that they live, right? So this is always the risk for me, is coming into a place where I don't really know the history of Albany. You guys probably, I feel like a kindergartner here, explaining stuff that you already know. But for this project, we try and use kind of the local to get people thinking about these federal policies, these federal housing policies that have had such a kind of dramatic effect on wealth creation in the 20th century, to the benefit of white native-born families and to the detriment of African-American and, to a lesser extent, immigrant families. Mapping this also does other things, right? So I'm going to pivot a little bit to the structural, and this is a very famous diagram from early 20th century sociologist Ernest Burgess, and that is a representation of his theories about the way American cities or cities develop, concentric zone theory. And his idea was that cities are clustered around a downtown, a loop. He was in Chicago. And around that cluster is an area where it's transitioning, and the industrial and commercial centers are always kind of pushing out. All these always push out through just kind of a process of growth. Around that you have working class families. Around that you have middle class residential families, and outside of that you have emerging suburbs. And this is decidedly racialized. So this is how he applies this to Chicago. And you can see in the center Little Sicily and Chinatown and the ghetto, and then a little further out from that you have older immigrant communities, like first generation, like early 19th century immigrant communities, Deutschland, and the black belt that runs north to south from outside the loop. And then outside of that you have the bright light areas and the residential hotels and single family dwellings. So very much kind of a class and a racial conception of the way cities are organized. And one kind of gentle argument we make in mapping inequality is that that what Burgess had as descriptive theory becomes prescriptive policies, because they apply these, and you can see this pattern of lower grades being concentrated towards the center of cities, and as you move out from them, the grades typically get higher. So in Albany, and think of the circles around on the Albany map, right? They're very much thinking about like the distance from the center of the city is a predictor, a meaningful predictor, or a meaningful variable in the character and quality of a neighborhood. So you have the D neighborhoods clustered. Mapping inequalities kind of encourages that play to think about the spatial organization of cities. So hovering over D highlights the D neighborhoods, which cluster towards the center. With the exception of the area we're actually near, which is sparsely settled, most of the C neighborhoods are kind of abut the A neighborhoods, and then you go a little further out and you get the B neighborhoods, and you go a little further out and you get the A neighborhoods. And Albany, and there are obviously exceptions to this. This is not a perfect theory and it's not applied perfectly, but it does give you a sense of the class and racial and wealth organization of American cities in the early 20th century. Again, what do I say? So, this happens in many cities. We kind of actually use these markers as a kind of way of hinting at that spatial organization as well. And try and use mapping inequality not just to facilitate a local study like exploring Albany, but to explore this across space. What's my point here? Oh, yeah, let's back up a little bit. So thinking about design and that second thread I was talking about different views on of the data. In mapping inequality, we have what we've done is we've taken all the maps that were produced by the Homozoan Corporation, and we georeference them and georectify them, which means we can kind of lay them over a digital map, right? And so this is, we see Albany, and I think a little bit to the north under there, you can see a little bit of Troy peeking out. But we've got this as data now, so we can drop that out and we can overlay it on the modern streetscape, right? And so we're trying to kind of bring the past and the present into some conversation with one another and help people orient themselves as so it's both a practical and there's a kind of gentle interpretive prompt to see the impact of the past upon the present. Oops, backed up a little bit there. And then this is actually this is kind of a design accident, but we just kind of I needed to cut out all the individual neighborhoods for some design functionality, and then I kind of realized we could just ditch everything that's not that. And I really like this view. I don't know, I may be reading too much into it, and maybe I want to read too much into it because it took just an immense amount of time to develop. But I really love how this view does that same thing. It brings the past into the present, it hits at the materiality and the historicity of the maps, while at the same time situating this on the modern streetscape in a way that I hope prompts people to make that, kind of gently nudges them to think about the connections between past and present, thinks about the impact of redlining upon creating wealth and racial inequalities that last to this day. Another thing we've done in mapping inequalities, we give all the data away too. This is another great surprising success. We always gave the data away, and like what are people going to do with this? But we've been really happy about the impact this has had. I'm going to walk you through just a few exemplary things. So we give the data away for individual cities or for the project as a whole, and these are a handful of things that have come out using that data. The kind of most important study that's directly about redlining is a white paper that's been a couple times revised by 3 economists at the Federal Reserve in Chicago, where they quantify the effects of these maps upon creating wealth inequalities and the long-lasting effects of that. And I won't go through their methods. It's pretty technical and spatial and statistical, but and they come up with this number, which I'm a little dubious of, like 15% of wealth inequalities in American cities today can be attributed to the Holt maps, which seems to be a little specific, but it is still a really compelling and in my mind, the best argument that's been made today, documenting the impact of these maps in not just reflecting but creating wealth inequalities. This was picked up by the New York Times, so I really like the public history, the kind of more broad journalistic reflections upon this. Zillow, for the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, took this and they revealed that not only have the inequalities of the 1930s persisted, they've widened, where the houses in A neighborhoods, there's been an increase in the value over time of all these houses, but there's been a greater increase in the higher the rate of the neighborhood, the greater the increase. Slate did a similar story. And then there's been some really great offshoots of this. So Wen-Fei Xu is a data scientist. She took this and has a really beautiful viewer, which again connects past and present, where you can slide back and forth and pick any number of variables from today and see the perhaps unsurprising but still nonetheless revelatory correlations between the past and present. This one is a graduate student was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, and he did a story map about gerrymandering. And one thing I was shocked by when he sent me this was how closely the maps of redlining in North Carolina matched up to what was the most gerrymandered unconstitutional. It was the North Carolina 12th, which stretches. So we're looking at Charlotte there, and if you can see the 12th includes most of the C and D neighborhoods, and it wraps itself and excludes the A and B neighborhoods. And we're going to kind of follow this snake-like district up, let's see here, to Winston-Salem, which it does the same thing, and then it wraps itself around and then swings around and I mean, they obviously were not using the Holt maps, but it's just a kind of another indication of how long-lasting and entrenched these patterns are. These wealth and class and racial patterns are. And then this one is super depressing. I'll be quick about it. This Jerry Van Hoffman, who's a scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia in Richmond, he's doing a study of heat island effects in American cities and heat vulnerability. And the map on the left is his map of heat vulnerability in Richmond. And the point he makes is it matches up really closely to the redlining map of Richmond. And then he's extrapolated this using LiDAR data to look at the heat distribution in not just Richmond, but in 200, all these American cities. And as you can see from this, even these box graphs, the highest of the, what is it? I guess the box graph is 80%. The highest in heat in A neighborhoods is lower than the lowest heat in D neighborhoods. How much hotter those, and this is going to have such a dramatic effect as cities heat up in the next several decades. And this makes the same point. Regardless of region, if you're, I pitched to him if anyone likes Wilco, right? There's a song from Poor Places. It's hot in the poor places tonight, and that is exactly what the point is here. Like the most vulnerable people, the poorest people, are the ones that are going to bear the brunt of heat island impacts of climate change and effects. Yeah. Okay. Leaving aside redlining, another of our maps, this is a map of foreign-born population. I won't speak of this at such length. I picked out Albany, though, and I picked out Albany in Albany. Albany in 1940, and as you can see, the foreign-born population matches up what we saw in the Hulk maps, where the largest percentage of foreign-born were Italians, followed by Poles and Germans. And this, yeah, again, like this is a map where we're trying to kind of think about people diving into where they are to explore the history of the places that they live, but then be able to situate that in a broader structure, or to jump out if you're Italian American and look at the distribution of Italian Americans at any given decade within the United States. Another of our maps is forced migration of enslaved people, which I really find this one super interesting. It hasn't quite got as much attention as I feel like I need to redo it, because it's a really important subject, which is the domestic slave trade in the United States and the movement. It's like the not great migration. It's like the bad migration. The movement of 1 million people from the upper South to the lower South in the half century before emancipation. And so what you're looking at is, this is the most granular map I think that's been produced to date of this phenomenon. Is we can only, and I won't get into too much detail, you have to model this, right? Because this census never kept track of where enslaved people, their natal homes. So we have to use just broad census data to do some calculations that you've typically been done at the state level, but with some GIS modeling, we're able to do this at a county level for this map. And so what you're looking at is we represent these using these hex bins, these dots, and the red dot means there's an in-migration. People either brought in, moved in forcibly, maybe with an owner, or more and more over time, they're sold in some place where in the blue dots, and they're moved to the red dots. And the bigger the dot, the more people. So if it fills like that concentration, which we'll get to near Huntington, Alabama, big red dot right in the middle, each of those dots is like 1,200 people that were forcibly moved into that area. So at little history. Here you see that like most regions in the American South in the 1810s were importing regions. Some parts of the upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware slightly, and little bits of North Carolina, and along the coast of Georgia and South Carolina were exporting regions. Moving forward in time to the 1820s, you see that more and more areas are become exporting, and you see kind of let's go back here. The big areas that don't have any data for Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. Those were controlled by native peoples, right? And then with the seizures, Indian wars and seizures, forced secessions of lands, you see this kind of rush of settlers into there, and more of enslaved people that are rushed into those areas to grow cotton and cultivate the land. And which really emerges in the kind of the fever times of the 1830s with a huge boom in cotton production. And you see that Black Belt, that area of intense cotton production that runs through Mississippi and Alabama into Georgia. And again, you keep seeing more and more blue, right? More and more regions. You see an intensification of slave trade. This is nearly 300,000 people moved during this decade. Because of the number of, just the trauma of that. So there's cotton, so we try and provide some explanation of this and some context for this. That's sugar production, intense sugar production. The if you remember history, the 1830s saw like a major depression, the Panic of 1837, and there was another panic in 39. So the 1840s took a decade to recover from, and you don't see the kind of same intensity as you move into the 1840s. But then cotton economy recovers, and you see re-intensification of the American slave trade in the 1950s, and also you see like huge amounts of the American South have become exporting regions, right? So there's a pattern here where the exporting regions just keep growing and moving from upper South to lower South, where now at this point there's parts of Alabama, Natchez District, most of Georgia that had surplus population that they needed I can go on about like this in the origin of the Civil War, but I won't. seeing this from a different point of view, let's look at this from Madison County near Alabama. In the 1810s, it started 1810. The enslaved population estimate. Enslaved population they had 916 enslaved people. In 1820, they had 8,600 for an estimated increase of 6,400 people were brought into that area during this decade. Jumping forward, you see it's not as intense, right? They start the decade off around 9,000 and around 14,000, bringing in about 1,600 people. And then it just stabilizes, and it becomes a net exporting region, right? So the point here, right, is that they've the variable you don't have any more of is land, right? And the gold standard for cultivating cotton was for a single enslaved person and 10 acres of cotton. Right? So once you've got a labor force that is the right size for harvesting the amount of arable land, right? Whatever natural population growth happens becomes labor force that can be transformed through the necromancy of enslavement and the slave trade into a commodity that can be then sold for profit, right? So transformation of labor into commodity, which is what happens here. So at this decade, you have every decade about like 25 to 30%, the slave population in the United States increased by 25 to 30%. So that 25% is then moved sold to another region in the United States, which happens decade after decade. You see, it just hovers around 14,000 people during the 1840s, with that natural increase being sold in the slave market, and the same thing happens in the 1850s, right? So you can see the pattern here. Another way of looking at this pattern, real quick, is this is a little more complicated, but really revelatory. So what you see on the x-axis is enslaved people per square mile. So the further you get to the right, the more enslaved people there are per square mile. So there are a lot of enslaved people, and the red dots and the higher up you get means that there's in-migrations happening. Each of these are counting too. There's in-migrations, and then the blue dots means there's out-migrations. So towards the top, these are counties where slave owners and slavers are selling people, and towards the bottom, where they're buying people, and towards the bottom is where they're selling people. And what I want you to notice when I play this is a kind of waterfall effect, where the counties get to the upper right-hand quadrant, and then they drop. They move from being intense importers to exporters, and decade after decade. So let's see if this works. So drops. This is like a common pattern. This is the economics of the slave trade. Are you noting that? I don't know if that's. Let's forget and the part where this seems to happen is about one enslaved person per 25 acres. Not exactly matching up to that 10 acres, but obviously not every square, every portion of a county is arable. Okay, I've been talking about this in the abstract, and I'm like, we do not want to. We're really uncomfortable with that, right? We're really uncomfortable with the idea that we would talk about the slave trade and talk about it in terms of in-migrations and out-migrations and purchases and sales without trying to attend to the human trauma of this, to the experience of being separated from children and from family, to the horrors of being moved, like walking hundreds of miles over the course of months from Virginia to Alabama. The terrors of being auctioned on the block. So I'm not positive we have done an adequate job of this, but we have tried to we've mined the slave narratives and picked out places where enslaved people testified to the pain and the trauma and the experience of enslavement, and georeference those so that you can balance this, kind of look at the structure and the larger patterns within the slave trade with at least a sense of the human's cost of this and the human experience of this from enslaved people's own words. I'm not positive we did enough with this, but this is the the effort that we've made with this map. Okay. Moving along. This is another map about migration, different migration, same period, which is movements of hundreds of thousands of people from the east to the west along the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. And we, again, it's kind of similar impulse. We thought, like, what can we do with this? It's interesting. And so what we did is we went through 24 diaries and trail journals, and we georeferenced them. Like, where were they every day that they wrote these things? Because these journals were often very much about they're guides for future migrants. So they're like, where can you, like, this is a great place where you can get grass for your oxen, and we had a lot of trouble fording this stream at this point, and they kind of provide a how-to about how to make that month-long journey from east to west. And I'm going to show you one of this. Was this Elizabeth Goltra's 1853 journal, and the most poetic thing she says is in the first entry, which is April 29th, 1853. Today we started across the dreary plains. Sad are the thoughts that steal over the reflecting mind. I'm leaving my home, my early friends and associates, perhaps never to see them again, exchanging the disinterested solicitudes of fond friends for the cold and unsympathizing friendship of strangers. Shall we reach the El Dorado of our hopes? You get this point. But then it quickly switches, and it's like grass, stream, cattle. Grass, stream, cattle. It's not the most interesting. But you could read that if you're, and as you read it, the map, you can kind of follow her 20-mile-a-day journey across the American West over the course of several months. Until she, unlike the Oregon Trail, no dysentery, she makes it. She's, and one of the reasons that I know she makes, because if you look at the, you probably can't read that, but this is me being a little self-indulgent, not just at this moment, but in this particular map. The citation for this is Elizabeth Goltra, a typescript of 1853 diary, no date, and Robert K. Nelson's private collection. This was my great-great-grandmother. So this is kind of the reason I want to do this map is I had her thing. Let's just skip canals, because everybody else does. We have a map of canals, and there's my favorite thing I will say is we had our students go through and explain what staves are. You know, there's a lot of things in there, nobody's going to know what these things are. We wanted this map to be really about economic exchange, not just about ditches full of water, but about, you know, these vital arteries of commerce in the early 19th century. And actually, I back up. So along the Erie Canal, they transported a massive amount of what they called products to the forest in their annual reports. They had staves, which staves are wood strips used in the production of barrels, and they had over 200 million pounds of those moved across. And they had a bunch of wood. And what did our students write about wood, which I like? Wood, the hard substance that makes up the stems and branches of trees and shrubs, which when I discovered that after the fact, I really appreciated that little joke in there. So let's move on to that. One of our more recent maps was an electoral map for the Congress. We did this right before the 2018 election. We need to incorporate 2018 in this. Again, like using design, I love the design of this map, to encourage thinking about electoral strength and regionality and over time and space. So what you're looking at now is like the kind of most conventional map, which has each of the congressional districts with colored either red or blue based upon who won in 2016. Pretty conventional too, which this is the strength of victory. So the closer it gets to gray, the closer this election is. Let's see here. But I like this cartogram, right? Because the maps are really, you know, there's a ton, obviously, of congressional districts in New York City, which you just can't even see on the map. And so we have a kind of a door-link cartogram where we break these things out and use some collision detection to keep them as close as we can to their location on the map, but not have them overlap with one another. And then we wrote a little algorithm to figure out which ones of those are within metropolitan statistical areas, or overlap significantly with metropolitan statistical areas, and then we include those within city circles. So like trying to think both about, this shows something about region, which is important, and at some points more important than other points. Obviously the geographic divide that we often are thinking about now is a distinction between urban and rural, and we want people to be able to explore that, not just today, but in the past as well. And again, scaling down into the local. So you can dive in where this is well, it's Albany's district with Paul Tonko is your congressional representative, and this is the strength of the parties across time for this area, which is another little bit of GIS manipulation, because obviously the district changes, but it's pretty stable actually in Albany. You've been strongly Democratic since the 1960s, and you can then dive in and kind of look at the districts as it's changed over time, both spatially, in terms of strength. I don't have the strength up here, and then move back in time. So the last time it was Republican was 1968 with Daniel Putnam, is that what it says? Well, hard to see. But really strongly Democratic back into the through most of the 20th century, predating the New Deal. Opposition in 1854, which is kind of a post-Whig, not exactly pre-Republican, but post-Whig party, and then, but strongly Whig. If you wanted to know, you were interested in the political strength of the Whig party in your part of the country, this answers that a little bit. This is a map this came out of a class actually, so this is a map that one of my colleagues, Tim Barney, he teaches a first-year seminar called The Rhetorical Lives of Maps. And one thing it's mostly about reading maps, and reading maps during the Cold War, which is Tim's area of expertise. But he also wanted the students to just think a little bit about designing maps. So he found a data set which was the foreign visits that were made by presidents and secretaries of states during the 20th century on the State Department's website. And he had his students amass that data, do a little assign spatial locations to that, and then think and do a little bit of exercises about how they would display that and design that. This is my version. They didn't design this, I designed this, but this is a map of, again, presidential visits abroad that shows, where foreign policy attention, at least foreign policy attention, if you take visits by presidents and secretaries of states as a proxy for that attention, happens regionally over the course of time, and allows, I like the circle, that's Theodore Roosevelt, first trip to Panama, but then you look at Obama, and like each of those is a trip. The furthest one, the far you get out on the ring that's represents distance from Washington D.C. and I should explain that, right? So I forget what this projection is called, but D.C. is right in the center, and then it kind of radiates out from that, so you get a kind of sense of distance from the U.S. And yeah, what did Obama's probably, I think, further trip was Bali in Indonesia that he made in 2011. Okay, where I'm going to end is kind of where we began, which was talking about housing policy, housing and urban policy in the 20th century, and particularly the racial dimension of this. So this is a screenshot of Renewing Inequality, which was our sequel of sorts to Mapping Inequality. If Mapping Inequality looked at redlining in the 1930s, and I mean, to be honest, we were a little concerned that people were ascribing too much importance to that data availability. Then it's just easy to take that data because that data is readily available and say, look, the federal government did this, and that's responsible for all the inequalities we see in American cities today. And obviously, that's just overly simplistic. And one way we wanted to do a kind of modest corrective for that is to look at another, arguably more impactful federal policy, urban policy, which is urban renewal in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. And there's lots of things you can say about urban renewal. And we collected a massive amounts of data that our core students transcribed that we ended up not using, like what did we not use? We for each project, and there's thousands of them, we collected data about the number of substandard and standard houses. We did nothing with that data, those core students. But the piece of data that we ended up concentrating on, because it told the story we wanted to tell, was about families that were displaced, the number of them by urban renewal policies. Comes out of starts as a housing policy and always remains a housing policy. That's supposed to get people into better homes, get them out of slums. So they seize property through eminent domain, raze it, destroy it. Sometimes put up public housing, sometimes use it for something else. So what we're looking at now is a cartogram that shows the number of families that are displaced in like cities large and small across the U.S., which is one of the I think contributions that this makes. It's not just New York and Chicago, though those did have the most displacements. It's a bunch of tiny, small cities, some of them less than 1,000 people, that took federal money, hardly places we think of as urban, took urban renewal funds and displaced families. The color of these dots reflects the number of families of color versus white families that were displaced. So the more purple it is means the more families of color, mostly African Americans, but not always, were displaced, and the greener it is mean the more white families there were. So so Chicago displaced more African American families, New York displaced more white families. This can give you a kind of false sense of the impact upon African Americans. If you look at this map, one conclusion you might draw from it is South was far more targeted African Americans far more than northern cities, right? And you might say of course, the South, right? Like this kind of simple, facile, incorrect sense of where racial prejudice and discriminatory policies happen in the United States. So one way of correcting that perception is to view this from a different perspective. So this is a chart, every one of the same exact representations. They're cities, but what we've done is it looks more complicated than it is. I mean, it's really just a real simple chart with this, let's call this the Y axes. That's the percentage of cities that were white. So the further you get in that direction means they're really white cities. Then on the other axis is displacements. So down here, that means those are really, really overwhelmingly white cities, 90 to 100% white, where 90 to 100% of the displacements were people of color. And the yellow line in the middle means anything that falls below that line, it might be that they displaced 95% white, but and 5% people of color, but there might have been 0.5% of people of color, so you'd be 10 times more likely as a person of color, a family of color in that city to be displaced than a white family. So anything, and you can see it's most of these, that fall below the yellow line disproportionately relative to the population displaced families of color. There's Albany. So Albany was 92% white, so predominantly white city, but 55% of its displacements were people of color, families of color. So let's take a peek at that. I do not, this has been shocking, really surprising for us how hard it's been to find footprints for these. These are multi-million-dollar projects, and we've got, I think, the largest collection of geographic information about urban renewal projects, but we don't have them all. And for Albany, we've only got one, which is the South End Number 2 project. We don't have the 3 projects that we have displacement data for, which is the Clinton Avenue North project and South End And remember, the south end was the one we looked at the beginning. It's had the red light district. It was categorized as a slum, and that's 20 years after that redlining categorization. It was a target for urban renewal and raised, displacing about 50 families, most of them African American. That is, and underlaying this, we can underlay this with poverty and racial data. So the more intense the color, the more families were living below the poverty line. And then the greener, it's a whiter neighborhood, the purpler, it's a neighborhood of color. Other, Clinton Avenue, I believe, is in what was the Arbor Hill neighborhood, or is the Arbor Hill neighborhood. Clinton, so I'm sure that did target a neighborhood that had a number of African Americans in it, as did the North Project, which I'm not positive where that is, and we still do need to find these maps. But I am confident this is underlaying, kind of ending where we began with the redlining map of Albany. It's not a surprise that so many urban renewal projects obviously happens in areas that are redlining, right? I mean, urban renewal is if you take a generous look at urban renewal or generous perspective on urban renewal and say this was the federal government's effort to get people out of slums into better housing. You could also say that they worsened this through redlining policies in the 1930s, because if they had obviously like slum-like conditions in the 1930s, cutting those areas off from capital through redlining regulations and redlining advice helped produce a problem that they then ostensibly tried to solve through urban renewal projects in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, which had, again, like a huge cost by destroying communities across the country, which David and Stacy know more about than I do. Thank you. Let's just say thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
For someone who wants to learn how to do this sort of data visualization, what tools do they have to learn? What's the learning curve? How long does it take?
That's a rough question. Well, okay. So there's two ends to this. I would say there's lots of out-of-the-box tools, particularly from ARC, maybe Cardo, that will let you produce actually some pretty good maps pretty easily, where if you have spatial information, you can dump that in GeoJSON IO. So there's some out-of-the-box things. There is a big leap, a big learning curve to doing something that's, I mean, this is pretty bespoke, I'd say, right? And which I think is one of the reasons that they're as well received as they are, is because they just do involve, and this is that craft portion I was talking about. It's like that attention to detail, and that ability. I mean, coming back to my issue, my point is about design. We try and think and experiment with different designs that we think surface the interpretive points or offer interpretive affordances that we think will be useful, and that often involves kind of idiosyncratic and sometimes really annoyingly difficult design and data challenges. And those are the kinds of things you can't do can't do as easily in Esri or Cardo or these easy tools, right? They have like some great design options in them, but they're also really limited, and it's a big step beyond those to make something that paint by numbers might be exaggerating the limitations of that, but not by much, right? I mean, you're stuck, and to take the next step to be able to have more control over design is a big leap. I hate to say, but it's the reality.
Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting, and I just really a great privilege to hear the PI walk us through these projects, and I really appreciated that. And I really appreciated also the interest in this design element, the kind of visual reception of these projects. And so I kind of have two questions that are linked to each other. The first is, you talked about design mostly on the kind of the production side. How much user testing do you do to kind of understand how these are received? Because obviously when you're working with the data, you get kind of lost in, like, it makes sense to you, but then there's always the question of what happens when it goes out into the world. And so that's the kind of first part of this. And the second part is, these are just gorgeous. I love the virtuosity is really amazing, but I'm wondering how you're grappling with making arguments based on mainly on color gradations and dealing with visual impairment and making these accessible. And that's something that I've been grappling with my own visualizations. I'm like, I want it to look beautiful, but then when you use some of the color palettes that are, I think, more legible to the visually impaired, they suddenly look very different to my eye, at least. And so I'm just wondering, how you're grappling with those issues.
Let's start with the second question first, and I just had to fess up, we've not done an adequate job. There is no question that we actually do need to pay attention to that, and it's one thing we need to revisit all of these essentially to make sure that that's the case. I'm fortunately a little colorblind myself, so that is, I guess, a bonus in this case, because though I'm not as severe as other people, and we really do need to be mindful of that. Yeah, so thank you. I mean, that's actually a really excellent prompt, because we have thought about that but have not made the effort that we need to make. And the user, I want to say, partly I'd say not enough user testing. Partly I'd say that has never been at least mine, and since I direct this, and so I have the final say in this. We've done a little bit, and we do it kind of informally. We might bring it into a class, have students play around with it, ask them some questions, just get a little bit of testing, but we are not systematic about that by any means. Yeah, we kind of tend to trust I don't think this is the right answer, but we are not, user, I mean, I've gone to meetings where people say let's imagine Stacy, and Stacy's an 8th grader in Ohio, and she's interested in X. How does she do that? And that's not the way we think. We think what are the points that we want to convey? What do we want people to be able to take away from this if they look at it for 30 seconds, 60 seconds? That's and we do the best we can with that, and we kind of trust our gut. Yeah, so I don't know. We've done a little bit of user testing, but I've never found it really change things that much. And part of it, I guess, is a little bit of authorial control. I guess is even when we've gotten feedback, sometimes we really like that. We're just going to stick with it. And it's partly about that craft. It's about having an investment in the quality of your work, and of course listening to feedback, but at the same time trying to have a style and that is yours, right? And not just because user testing can sometimes be the lowest common denominator too, and I think we push back a little bit against that. That's a great question.
These are all really impressive, so thanks for sharing them with us. I have a question about the redlining maps. I noticed there's white areas that are not rated but do have housing. Can you talk about why that was the case?
Well, they might not have been the 1930s. So they typically did all neighborhoods that they viewed as residential neighborhoods, right? Which doesn't mean that there's not a handful of houses that would fall out of that, but most of the white areas are either commercial, industrial, or public uses, or non-residential. Yeah. So, and I've seen a handful of exceptions, but not very many of them. So my guess is when they made that in the 1930s, those areas in Albany were built up, or more minimally built up.
Thank you. I was wondering if you mentioned the Albany area thing. I was curious, how do you continue to get data? Like you mentioned, there wasn't enough for Albany, for example. I was just wondering.
Oh yeah.
How do you continue? It's sort of a user testing question, but more like, how do we get data to you? How do you follow up and make sure you're not just mapping and replicating inequalities you mentioned? Thank you.
Oh, okay. There's two questions here. So, one is just kind of about these, or at least I'm going to give you an answer to a question I might have heard, which is that one of the issues with digital scholarship is that these things are always always a temptation to keep revisiting them and keep improving, and which is both great and bad. I mean, especially now that we've got 8 of these things up, it's I keep wanting to revisit them rather than do new things, right? And so that you can get stuck where you're just you're not doing new work, and instead you're approving old work, and we have not done as much. We do encourage people, like we thought for the urban renewal that we'd release this and people would go to Albany and say, like, I'm not seeing these projects and I have a map of these things, I will send them, but we have not had as much of that as we would have liked. What was the second question? Sorry.
Oh, just so that we're not replicating inequalities?
Oh.
Like, how do we be sure that we are getting that?
Yeah, that's a really challenging question. So what I'd say is that the data that we have here, let me ask a question I'm potentially hearing, which is, are you giving this, is this data kind of useful for those who want to gentrify an area, right? Like, is this a way that they could target areas that have essentially been kind of killed and lined fallow and become investment opportunities in the 21st century by looking at places that were so badly damaged by housing policies in the 20th century? And I guess my answer to that would be they already have this data, like they're not getting it from us. And so I think of this as counter mapping efforts, right? This is I mean, I have, maybe they know better, but I've heard from a lot of people that are invested in issues of equity around housing or transportation. They reach out to us all the time, and progressive organizations are using this for fair housing purposes in their advocacy, or trying to redress issues of the past. I have not heard from anybody saying, like, this is great, I am going to make a buck off of this thing. Maybe they know better than to write me about that, and realize I'm not going to be particularly helpful with that. I think of this like we are providing data to organizations that again want to address these historical inequities, and those that are interested in taking advantage. They already have this data. Like I don't think like real estate speculators were waiting for us to produce these DH projects. They have it already. Does that kind of answer? Does that give that question?
Yeah, more about how do we make sure it's like living up to its potential that you've raised here. How do we get that data? There are probably people in Albany who have some. How do we ensure that you get it? Like, I want it to be accurate.
Oh. I'm not positive. So what's?
Well, you've seen the film, I'm sure, The Neighborhood That Disappeared, about the Albany area and what happened to all the people that were classified as slum. So I'm just thinking by now there's probably much more data that could be useful to add into.
Oh yeah. And I would say David stays here working on that, right? So we have been pretty we are tending to the local, and I think I've kind of that's one of the themes here. But at the same time, we recognize we are not doing, especially as something like mapping inequality or renewing quality, where we're looking nationwide, we are not doing justice to the local stories involved here, right? But we give the data away, and if it can be of help to people who want to dive deeper into their local history and know more about the local history than we do, great, right? So we kind of see this as broad, a little bit shallow, but an invitation for people to pick up on this, an invitation for them to ask questions that we're not answering in the project itself, but that they can use this as a prompt and use the data as a seed to pick up on those questions. So yeah, I mean, we certainly have just scratched the surface on all these histories and want to stimulate other work, which.
We have time for two more questions.
This is less of a question than a response to the previous question. The issue with urban renewal is there's nearly 1,300 sites around the country that are urban renewal projects. And the project that I'm working on with Ann Fowle and Stacey Sewell covers 4 cities in New York, including Albany, and you really have to do a pretty deep dive into the local histories in order to do a good job of understanding urban renewal. We have another NEH grant pending that will create a statewide inventory of urban renewal records, because these are all held locally. If you go to the National Archives, you're not going to find that much in the way of records that speak to local conditions. So this is a national phenomenon, but it's resolutely local. So for a project like what Rob and his colleagues are doing, it's not really possible to do this kind of intensive deep dive into the local conditions. So a really good history of urban renewal has to integrate sort of the national story with the various local stories.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. There's always a sort of temptation to think with digital tools that they're easy or they're fast. Can you talk a little bit about the resources required and the funding that supports this type of work?
Yeah, okay, so that's a great question. So the American Panorama was initially funded by a very generous grant from the Mellon Foundation. Thank you, Mellon. And the first 4 maps, the ones on the slave trade, canals, foreign-born population, and westward migration, those were developed in partnership with a commercial company, Statement Design, which they're amazing. And one of the great things about that was it became, for us, a kind of apprenticeship in some modern development, mapping and design. Some of the better practices in development and design. So the subsequent 4 maps, renewing inequality, mapping inequality, the executive abroad in the elections, the Congress map, those were developed in-house for us. And the resources are, let me give a lot of credit. So I run a very small the digital scholarship lab is fairly small, but not small for a small liberal arts college. It's me. I have Justin Madron, who's a GIS analyst and organizes our spatial data, and Nate Ayers, who works on issues of design and visualization. So it's the 3 of us, but for mapping inequality, we worked with, most of it was done, all the development was done by us, but we work with both in terms of thinking about the project conceptually, doing some of the georeferencing, and certainly getting materials from the National Archive. We worked with partners at Virginia Tech, led by Dale Windling, Richard Marciano at the University of Maryland, and Nathan Conley at Hopkins. And then we had an undergrad, we had a pre-doc and a postdoc, pre-doc Leif Fredrickson and the postdoc Brent Siebel, who worked on the urban renewal project with us. Brent's the co-author of that. And those were funded by Mellon. So it's been very much a collaborative effort. So I don't want to so it's building those collaborations. And for me, I feel like a loiterer in 20th century American urban history. My wife's an urban historian. Happy anniversary, Amy. It's our anniversary. She'll have to watch this whole thing until the very end to get that. Where was I? Oh, so making partnerships with people who know and can have area expertise that we're not. I'm a 19th centuryist, so the slave trail, that was the one most of my wheelhouse in terms of my own research. Though I've gotten obviously super interested in issues of race and in 20th century American cities, but I'm not an expert in that. Dale's an expert in that. Nathan's an expert in that. And building those relationships has enriched those projects enormously. In terms of funding, we're not super dependent on funding. I'll make a really important caveat to that. Everybody in my lab is on hard money, so which is just a real blessing, because I do not have to be constantly searching for grants, which is obviously a time suck. We can do our work, and I don't have to worry about, and no one has to worry about losing their job because of we didn't get a grant or something like that. We're not obviously averse to getting grants, but we don't apply for them very much. They're a real huge amount of time, and one of the issues with grants is, like, say, with the NEH, right? for me, like, we write a grant, and then we want to do the work, and we have to wait like 6 months for that to be evaluated. We might not get it, and then there's another, even if we get it, it's another 3 months before it starts to disperse, and it's like, I'm a fan of doing this kind of slowly in small teams without a lot of dependency on grant money. But we're fortunate because we are in hard money, and not every institution can do that. I'm at a pretty well-resourced university.
All right, I think we're at time. So,
No, thank you very much.
thank you.